and participants this year, and much of that will happen tomorrow here at BU. The conference planners of this conference envisioned that since Boston was to be held at the end of 2010, it could offer a summation and analysis of the previous Edinburgh conferences. Now, for those of you attending the conference, I offer humbly a brief introduction to sort of whet your appetite for the presentations that are to follow. But for others, I offer an all too brief exposure to at least 3 of the conferences that took place around the world this year. First, Edinburgh. I was privileged to be part of the Edinburgh 2010 conference held in June, and to hear Dana Robert, who you see here, give the keynote address entitled Witnessing to Christ Today, Missions and Unity in the Long View from 1910 to 2010. You just had a little sample of the riches that she gave us at Edinburgh. And truly, BU can be proud of Dr. Robert. It was the outstanding keynote lecture at Edinburgh 2010. Now, like Edinburgh 1910, initiation of the dream of holding the 2010 conference came initially from Scotland. As early as 2002, the Scottish Committee, known as Toward 2010, hosted annual conferences in Edinburgh relating to each of the Edinburgh 1910 commissions. Members represented the Church of Scotland and the University of Edinburgh, with Kenneth R. Ross, Secretary of the Church of Scotland World Missionary Council, as its chair. In 2005, 5 years ago, leaders broadly representative of world Christianity met in Edinburgh to begin the international and multi-dimensional project now known as Edinburgh 2010. In 2007, they formed a general council that brought together, in sponsorship of that conference, representatives of the 5 major streams of world Christianity today. That is Roman Catholicism, Orthodoxy, Protestants, Evangelical Protestants, and Pentecostals, also independents. Among them were representatives of the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization and the World Evangelical Alliance that would cooperate in sponsoring the Cape Town Conference held in October. Like Edinburgh 1910, this year's conference was preceded by a 2-year study process in groups around the world, each focused on one of 9 major themes. These were related to those themes back in 1910, but really rethought as to what were the primary issues for 21st century mission. These were foundations for mission, Christian mission among other faiths, mission and postmodernities, mission and power, forms of missionary engagement, theological education and formation, Christian communities in contemporary context, mission and unity, and mission, spirituality, and authentic discipleship. Papers produced in those conferences form one of the books out of Edinburgh 2010, and I think will be the most substantive, intellectual, conceptual contribution of Edinburgh 2010. It's worth getting and reading that volume. The papers produced by these study groups form the most in-depth analysis. Now, to Edinburgh 2010 came just 300 delegates. Remember, there were 1,200 in 1910. They were also from participating bodies. They were delegates. The proportions represented the new global reality of the worldwide Christian community that Dr. Robert has just outlined for us. 60% from the global south, or what's often called the majority world, 50% women, and 20% under age 30. And of course, those percentages overlap, but it gives you the percentages among the 300. As with recent WCC-sponsored World Mission Conferences, and I have attended each of them since Melbourne 1980, the consequence was that most delegates at Edinburgh were attending a World Conference on Mission for the very first time. Getting to know persons from other traditions, beginning to build friendships with them. This was a major outcome of Edinburgh 2010. I shall never forget the press conference addressed by the General Secretaries of the World Council of Churches, the World Evangelical Alliance, and the Pontifical Council of the Vatican for promoting Christian unity. It wasn't their formal statements to us about why they were at Edinburgh. It was what happened after the press conference. And I saw them as they engaged in informal conversation with each other. Clearly, they were becoming personal friends. Now, some people are saying, as a result of the election this week, that our President, Barack Obama, may need to build some of those friendships with people across the aisle. Clearly, I saw it happening at Edinburgh, and that will be one of the consequences of Edinburgh in future years as we think of these major groups working together. Personally, I found the process of the conference frustrating. Budgetary constraints limited the time available to 4 days. In addition to the 9 study themes, planners had identified 7 additional themes that they called transversals, which had relevance to each of the study themes. Women in mission, youth in mission, reconciliation and healing, Bible in mission, contextualization in culturalization and dialogue of worldviews, less heard constituencies called subaltern voices. I don't know whether that's an Anglican term. And ecological perspectives. Hear them as Dana was giving them, as themes coming up again. So each afternoon, we first met in small groups on one of the study themes. We were introduced to each other, coming from around the world. The conveners made a presentation to us. We were given 20 minutes to respond. Somebody took notes. The bell rang. You're to move to your next group of those in a subaltern group. So I met with those on women in mission. And we introduced ourselves, and the conveners gave us some ideas, and we talked for 20 minutes, and the bell rang, and we would go on to the next thing. Now, and those groups were to produce some creative ideas that could be brought to form the conference statement at the end of the conference. One paragraph from each of the study themes. Can you imagine the result? Intellectual paddling. That's how I judge the common call that came out of Edinburgh 2010. Now on Sunday, we gathered to celebrate the centenary in the General Assembly Hall of the Church of Scotland, where the original 1910 conference was held. We saw that earlier. But this is the picture from the celebration. I wondered how those black-suited, tied white men in 1910 would have taken in what we did that day. Vibrant worship, singing and dancing in the aisles, led by an African Caribbean choir, Asian dancers, and with the Archbishop of York, a Kenyan by birth, who we're going to hear on Sunday, exhorting us to deeper commitment to ecumenism and missionary witness. On their departure, each delegate received a small stone from the island of Iona, from the very beach where St. Columba landed in his skin boat in 635 AD, bringing the gospel from Ireland to Scotland, bringing Christianity to Scotland. What will be the legacy of Edinburgh 2010? Alas, it lacked three essential components of Edinburgh 1910. The General Council will wrap up its final meeting this month. There will be no continuing office or secretariat. In these economically challenging times, the participating stakeholder bodies have neither offered ongoing funding for the initiative, nor to date parallel grouping of the same broad spectrum of Christians called the Global Christian Forum. In his introduction to the conference, Andrew Anderson, chair of the General Council, presented his vision for Edinburgh 2010, and I quote, "To know and love one another as sisters and brothers of one family of the Lord our God, empowered by the Holy Spirit, who witnessed to Jesus Christ, his Son, in a divided and needy world." The same appeal as B.S. Azariah in 1910. Could that be our legacy? Yes. Second conference is Tokyo, though it happened first in May. The Global Mission Consultation, and it was focused on evangelization of unreached people groups, such as the vision that Dr. Robert has mentioned. What is often termed finishing the task or frontier missions. Inspired by the passion of the late Ralph Winter and organized by the U.S. Center for World Mission in Pasadena that he directed, Tokyo brought together 968 delegates from missionary societies and organizations, but mostly those in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Altogether, citizens from 73 countries attended, to be joined by another 927 observers from Japan and served by 550 Japanese volunteers. Recognizing that there are still almost 7,000 people groups in the globe that have no Christian presence or congregations in their midst. The theme of the conference was making disciples of every people in our generation. It clearly harked back to that famous watchword of John R. Mott and the student volunteer movement, the evangelization of the world in this generation. The fastest growing numbers of cross-cultural missionaries today come from the churches of the majority world of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. For example, last year in India, there were 210 Indian missionary organizations that support about 40,000 Christian workers working cross-culturally, either within India or outside. They have identified 204 ethnic people groups out of India's 953 with populations of more than 10,000 that did not yet have worshiping Christian fellowships. So for them to go as a cross-cultural missionary may be as important to go within India as to go to Saudi Arabia or Africa or the United States. The Tokyo consultation in its declaration valued and commemorated Edinburgh 1910 as, quote, an inspiration and impetus to the modern global mission movement. It declared, quote, the preponderance of missionary activity today is being engaged in by majority world Christians outside of the West. They pledge to facilitate cooperation and ongoing coordination among them through what is called a global network of mission structures. Third, to Cape Town, the largest 2010 event, which originally I had planned to attend, but I'm glad we're going to have others here who did attend. Sponsored by the Lausanne Committee for World Evangelization, planners drew 4,200 selected individual participants. No, they're not delegates. From 197 nations who were to represent the demographic, theological, and cultural realities of the global church. Using the latest technology, Congress videos and texts reached over 650 global link sites in 91 countries, with 100,000 unique visits recorded on the Cape Town 2010 website from 185 countries during the week of the Congress. I guess I was one of them. Held in conjunction with the World Evangelical Alliance, Cape Town is also to be known as Lausanne III. In the succession of the Lausanne Movement Congresses, held in Lausanne, Switzerland, 1974, Lausanne I, Manila, Lausanne II in 1989. Now, I diligently searched all Lausanne III documents and news releases that I could find, and I found absolutely no reference to Edinburgh 1910, nor claims that Lausanne movement is carrying out the vision from Edinburgh. I expected to find it, but I didn't. Instead, writers affirm that they are carrying out the legacy of Dr. Billy Graham and the 1974 Congress. The core theme at Cape Town was God in Christ reconciling the world to himself. Planners identified 6 core issues common to all regions. Each became a theme for a day, for plenary addresses and small group discussions. They were truth, reconciliation, world faiths, priorities, integrity, and partnership. And if I had another hour, I could tell you more about the content of all of that. The focus at Cape Town, as with all the conferences held this year, was not on the past in mission. None of them focused on the past. It was all looking forward. What is mission to be in the 21st century? Its challenges and opportunities. Lindsey Brown, International Director of the Lausanne Movement, hopes for a 4-fold legacy from Cape Town in 2010. First is what is called the Cape Town Commitment. This is a major statement that they are making. Part 1 was drafted by evangelical theologians with each continent represented on the drafting committee, was presented to the delegates at the final session. It is a Trinitarian statement fashioned in the language of love. Part 2 will be released in December. It's a call to action shaped by discussion of the critical issues at the conference. The second legacy that he would like to see is the challenge to bear witness to Jesus Christ in every part of the world, and note, in every sphere of society and realm of ideas. So once again, as Dr. Robert has presented, the frontiers are no longer geographical, even for Cape Town 2010. The third will be fruitful partnerships in mission stimulated by Lausanne 3. The fourth will be new creative initiatives following Cape Town. Now in conclusion, Richie Hogg, a mission historian, described Edinburgh 1910 as a turning point, a lens, a landmark, and a watershed. Can the marking of the centenary do for the 21st century what Edinburgh 1910 did for the 20th? Asked Kenneth Ross after Edinburgh 2010. Will mission-minded Christians, quote, have the courage to discover the larger Christ of whom John Mott spoke in 1910? Will they have the courage to set forth a contemporary and compelling vision of what it means to witness for Christ in the world of the 21st century? We cannot know what challenges will confront us and others as we seek to share the love of Christ in an increasingly fractured world. Our prayer is that we may have the passion of a St. Columba, to cross the barriers of nation and race and religion and ideology that divide us within the human family, to be more intentional in mission, to be more united in witness in our century. If we and they can do so, you and I will be part of the living legacy both of Edinburgh 1910 and of the celebrations in 2010.
Oh, man. You know that Professor did that. Thank you. It's hard to speak after Professor Robert. Professor Norman spoken. It humbles you a lot and you don't know what to say. I was a participant at the Edinburgh 2010 conference, and I think that was taken only at the Scottish Parliament. Remember that. And I represent the Anglican Communion among the 8 Anglican delegates who attended the conference, so I was among the 8 Anglicans. And I was speaking to Professor Robert during the conference as we walked around Edinburgh grounds, and she said to me, you know, the original intention of the conference was to have as many young people as possible. But only the Anglican Communion did the right thing. So for the first time, the Anglican Communion has done something right. Because we had the youngest delegation at the conference. And I'll talk more about that. But I want to start by saying something about the prospects of this conference. Now I see. At the end of the conference, we have these lovely words, see you in 2110. That is the end. That was flashed the screen of the conference. And I didn't understand what that meant. What were the planners thinking when they wished us that see you in 2110, when they knew that all of us who were present at that conference won't be there? And I thought they just meant it to be a joke. But later on I started thinking through that, and I feel that those words were the most important words of that conference. Because we can be deceived into thinking about 2010 as the final end of mission. We should be future-looking. Christian mission should be future-looking. And I think to me that was critical. I've looked at the website, the words are not there. But I still believe that forms to me the thinking point and the turning point of Christian mission in our century. Now, one important thing which humbled me a lot was to realize that there were so many Africans who were present at that conference, knowing that we moved from one to the black people being seen in the audience, which was good. But I also got a bit concerned by the fact that despite that, we also had a problem with the mission organization and schools and churches we start thinking about. The representation we had at the conference was mainly academic. And I've talked about in this presentation, as I go along, what I call liberating Christian mission from the academia. I think it's important for us to do that, because those groups were theologians sitting to discuss theological issues, and how does that reflect in what is happening to the people who are carrying on the mission, churches. So there must be a deliberate policy as we move to the future of engaging the future church which is doing the mission. So we have to deliberately, the academia should start working to do that, liberating mission from the academia. But I also realize, as Professor Robert has made clear in our presentation about the different contours, how global Christianity has become global. One of the worrying factors of Edinburgh 2010 for me was how the question of demographic growth in the South were celebrated. And we continue to celebrate that the church is growing so fast in the global South. Yet scientific evidence tells us again that the global South is the one which is hit the worst by the ecological crisis. The fact that the majority of those who are discussing mission are from the global North, they have the power to dictate what should be talked about. We are ignoring the real issues which the church in the global South faces. The women, the young people who are suffering from the ecological crisis. And I'm really honored to have Professor Daniel sit there, because he has really influenced me to start looking at mission that way. Christian mission should not continue to look at issues as though the earth is the same the way it was in 1910. Things are changing. Women are suffering. Kids are dying because of the environmental crisis. The crisis the church helped to create, as Professor Robert rightly said. We taught people that way. Now we should be responsible to unteach what we taught. And therefore, Christian mission has a role to play in addressing the ecological crisis. The other prospect I foresee is the influence of the global South partners who are working in the global North. And I'm very happy that Professor Robert avoided the word immigrant missionaries in our presentation, because this word has gained a lot of power in missionary discourse. Immigrant missionary, meaning those Africans or Asians who are working in Europe or in America. They are called immigrant missionaries. I realized that 1910, most of those people who gathered there, they were part of the empire, as we heard. Most of them partnered with the colonial governments to destroy other people's culture. But not a single missionary document calls them colonialist missionaries or imperialist missionaries. We call them missionaries. So when it comes to me and my fellow brothers from the global South, we are being called immigrant missionaries, using the same political discourse which is being used in America by the world. So it's one thing to talk about we are brothers and sisters in words, but in reality you are an immigrant and you are an immigrant Christian. But when you go on the global North, you are a missionary. When you work in Europe, you are still a missionary. But as long as your skin is black, you are an immigrant missionary. I think the future of mission depends on how we use language. We should avoid to use the worldly language the world uses to divide people. And I think Edinburgh 2010, the Kapya I attended, and I spoke against the word immigrant missionaries, which was originally used. But now I'm happy that Professor Robert has corrected that. And I hope that you're going to continue looking at people as people who are involved in God's mission, not necessarily the geographical location where they come from. Because all of us, as we know, we are all immigrants. That's what the scripture tells us. We are resident aliens, and we all participate as immigrants in God's mission. So that means that the way we use language in mission should also change. The other aspect with the prospect which worried me a lot was about the youth. Professor Robert reminded me during that walk across the campus. She bemoaned the fact that the young people were absent. And what we are celebrating today, most of it was a dream of students. But when it came to Edinburgh 2010, it became a gathering of professors. So you can see how we are leaving out the young people from Christian mission. And I think that it's important for Boston 2010 to rectify that and take back mission to the young people who have the energy to carry it on. Unless we are saying that God only calls professors and doctors, then we should ignore the young people. But ignoring the young people means they are not going to celebrate 2110. No one will be there. It's a challenge we have in this generation to hand over what I've called in my presentation somewhere, most of the time I'm not reading it, but what I've called a missionary obligation. 1910 gave us, handed over what we are celebrating today. 2010 has a moral responsibility, a missionary obligation to hand over the gospel to future generations. How are we going to do that depends on how churches and academic institutions rethink mission. I know we are very afraid to talk about the future at Edinburgh 2010. We are really afraid to confront the question of what does it mean to witness for Christ amidst the changing realities of globalization, multi-faith dialogue. Are we going to continue talking about the uniqueness of Christ when the world tells us not to because we are afraid? That's the challenge Christian mission has to face. Or else, we are just going to be another charitable organization if we ignore the uniqueness of Christ in how we present Christian mission to the world. Bearing in mind that Christian mission is not something that we began so we can negotiate. It's something that God began and we participate in what God is doing. And what God says we should do, all of us should do it. We have no choice but to participate in what God is doing in our time. And maybe it's here that we can listen to what the global South is saying about the uniqueness of Christ to the global North. Thank you.
Instead of doing some informal talk amongst us, we are going to take a few minutes to entertain questions, and then, of course, the conversation continues after the formal part of the program. So, for any of our panelists, any particular questions? Comments?
For any of them, I'd be interested, you talked about what themes were addressed. Any awareness of what themes were left out or avoided, not to be talked about?
For me, the reality of power and the fact that, as Dr. Kaoma has mentioned, we who have the economic power, or those who have the economic power, are not exercising it in a just and equitable way. We see in this country, and particularly in Korea, a prosperity gospel. This was mentioned. But the implications of this, when you have multinational corporations whose sole goal is to increase the profit for themselves, the executives, and occasionally the shareholders, rather than the well-being of the people who are being served. I think the economic justice issues were underrepresented. I think they were mentioned as a theme, but they were not a focus of discussion.
You mean all three conferences, or just in all three?
I think in all three, and of course they would say that their main focus was upon Christian mission. It was not a conference on global ethics. And they might have said if this was a conference on global ethics, that these would have had greater prominence. But the church was never addressed as an institution and what should be its relation with the structures of power within its context.
Do you think that's in fear of Edinburgh 1910, where World War II and World War I and World War II were immediately after it, so it's like we don't want to engage governments too much. We want the church to be the ones, by changing people's hearts versus changing policy directly. Do you see how, do you think that we're afraid to engage governments as directly as they would have 100 years ago because the results didn't seem to come out?
Well, I think many from the evangelical Protestant stream are still primarily in the emphasis upon conversion of persons and individual witness, and not of structures of power. Now, that is not true of all institutions, because you will have groups like World Vision, which are very much engaged also with issues of power, but it is still very much a charity focus that's there. For the Orthodox Christians, who in most places are still in a minority situation in which the church has been linked so closely with government, or was so oppressed by government, that they have not moved into the critical engagement with government. So from that stream, there is not so much. We can't really say much for the Vatican because they participated in Edinburgh, but the discussion was not deep enough, really, to identify this. And all we know is in the history of the ecumenical movement, we had a time in the 1970s in which they were actually, World Council of Churches and Roman Catholic Church were in active communication and considering the possibility of Roman Catholic membership, and what would that mean in terms of restructuring the WCC. And they had a commission on social justice, peace, together. And the reason that the Roman Catholics shied away was they felt that these world conferences, and this was true also of mission conferences, would make statements on economic issues, political issues, human rights issues, often drafted at the last minute and such, and that the governing bodies of the participating churches really had no control, but the press picked up the particularly salient points and emphasized them, and then the Roman Catholics felt if they participated that there would be a real tension with what the Vatican wanted and their careful process of deliberation on issues. So because Edinburgh was so short, it really didn't get dealt with in this way.
Before we move, Dr. Kaoma or Dr. Robert, no.
Dr. Thomas especially has mentioned how the genius of Edinburgh 1910 was the follow-up, the continuation of the full-time executive secretary and so forth. And then I think you also, Robert mentioned that Edinburgh 2010, May, June, it's kind of come to an end. They closed the door and dismantled the study structure and so forth. So that seemed to be kind of a closed chapter as far as the Edinburgh meeting. Did any of the other conferences, Japan, Cape Town, any others, did they provide for any continuation of the vision, the follow-up, and moving forward with whatever they saw and said at the conference?
Yes. Tokyo, the Association of Mission Agencies in the majority world, has an ongoing structure, and so they have a means of implementing it in a plan for this global network. Cape Town, of course, the Lausanne movement has a permanent executive. that could carry it on, and the World Evangelical Alliance has that as well. It's interesting in terms of Edinburgh 2010, my first thought was it was in the tradition of the World Council of Churches sponsored conferences, but that was not the case. World Council was an active participant and certainly a very generous funder. But really, the carrying on of this vision of bringing together Roman Catholics, Orthodox, Pentecostals, Evangelical, and ecumenical Protestants is really the Global Christian Forum, which has been meeting since 2007, but there again, not funded and not with a permanent secretariat.
Okay. Could I say something about the Global Network of Mission Structures? My name is Jeff Menard. I work in Pasadena at the U.S. Center for World Mission, and I got to go to Tokyo.
Oh, good.
That organization, what they're trying to do is, okay, if we recognize that globalization is a challenge to our time, but the communications industry has pretty much stated that they want to bring 50% of the world online within 10 years with an inexpensive device and services. Okay, if we just accept at some level that business is trying to do that, let's use it. So the Global Network of Mission Structures is mainly online tools and online structures to enable human beings around the world to create their own organizations, whatever it is. So it will be either pastor's resources for church and how to find elders, or it will be teaching, it will be everything you want, supposedly online, with senders and receivers all around the world. But that's what they're trying to do, Global Network of Mission Structures. And there's a couple people I can connect anybody with that are trying to run that, but it's just right now beginning. So that's the continuation is also with younger people is recognizing that it's going to be digital.
And on that, I was going to say something about those of us that were at Edinburgh 2010 as either stewards or as delegates, we're continuing by way of Facebook and other things to try to continue some sort of conversation amongst each other. And we're not sure what that looks like. We have less access to power, less access to money, but we're interested in continuing something from our experience there. And also the demographics that you mentioned were the goals for Edinburgh 2010. That was not the reality, I think, that of what occurred. 50% of delegates were not women. It was more of a 2-to-1 ratio of men and women. So young people between the ages of 18 and 30 were probably 5 to 10% of the breakdown, not 20%. So those were the goals, but not the reality of what occurred at the conference.
What she said, for those who can't hear, one of the things she said is that the goals for Edinburgh 2010 were not met, in the sense that the 50% of the delegates weren't women, there weren't enough young people. It was an effort, but it wasn't successful. And also that the networking of the young people at the conference is continuing. You see, I think this is, sometimes people have asked me, was the conference a failure because there were only 350 people there? I say absolutely not, because we're not living in 1910. In 1910, 1,200 delegates had to go by donkey cart and railroad and steamship and spend 10 days together and then go back, and they never saw each other again, many of them. But the Edinburgh 2010 conference, in my opinion, it was a kind of representative conference. And then we still have ongoing communication. And that's how we should look at it. Itself is in the context of global communications. So as one of the professors who was there, our task is to continue to see what does this mean. And to now the work begins. There was a lot generated, a lot of intellectual capital expended, a lot of ideas generated. Now what do we do with those? Okay, that's not finished. That's the beginning of where we are now.
I have read most of the documents on the website of Edinburgh 2010. And my question to those who attend is this, from the perspective of the Catholic Church, mission, in the strict sense, is carried out by most missionary religious orders, men and women. I ask whether at Edinburgh their presence were there and were felt, because in the future you talk about collaboration between different streams of Christianity. these people, the SVDs, the Marinolas, and many others of Italy and Pina, and the women, of course, also, they are the ones who carry the work. And if they are not represented actively, we just talk. They are the ones who need to bring to the table and have the conversation.
I spoke with quite a number of members of religious orders and religious communities. Now, the ones with whom I spoke tended to be older and were not necessarily official delegates. Because another thing this conference represented was a changing of the guard of the generations. And the Catholics, the young Catholics who were there tended not to be religious. The older Catholics who were there were members of religious communities. And I think that's a change taking place within Catholicism, so that there were young lay Catholics there. For me, the most poignant moment of the conference was when there was an African speaker who's head of the World Missionary Society. He was a young man from Cameroon, I think, in his 40s perhaps. And Mercy Adeoye, who of course is a highly honored person. I'm a Methodist, so she's kind of like a grandmother of many important things. She stood up. He was talking about mission, and she stood up and said, "What about the moratorium?" And he essentially said to her in lay language, "Old lady, sit down." He said, that was 40 years ago. He said, "I'm the head of the Berlin Missionary Society." I think it was Berlin. "There's no German telling me what to do. I'm running the show now. So that's an irrelevant issue." I thought, whoa, I don't know if he knew who she was. But that for me symbolized more than anything a shifting of the generations. I'm in my 50s, and then this is the first time there's been some significant mission event to which people of my age group were kind of in charge in any way. At least that's what it felt like. So it was a very interesting thing of wanting to cultivate young people, and yet most of the folks who were in their 70s were not delegates, mostly. They were there in other capacities, or they're participating on the side in some other way.
Dr. Robert and also Dr. Fan alluded to this last night. The content of evangelism. You had a paper that was in our alumni magazine a couple years ago about the omission and the commission. The teaching on everything Jesus commanded us to do. And would either of you like to comment on that? Is there any even creeping incremental progress across the 5 strands, especially, obviously each of the 5 strands has its own thing, but is there any evangelical, Pentecostal, mainline, etc., Catholic, etc., progress on consenting on what's the content of missionary evangelism?
Well, one of the things that has been a struggle is we had an organizing meeting here with Ralph Winter, Doug Birdsall, Daryl Balia, me, Rodney Peterson, and I forget who else, about Todd Johnson. We had a preliminary organizing meeting like a year and a half or 2 years ago. Was anybody else there? In order to thinking about history, what will history do in these conferences? The leadership, at least on the Protestant side, we were all Protestants, of the different conferences wanted very much for the future generations to realize there was some kind of unity among the different conferences. And we met here at the School of Theology and made a kind of a vow, or we will do our best to keep the conferences in dialogue with each other. Because we don't want future generations to say, now look, the ecumenical people had their conference and the evangelicals didn't participate. And now the evangelical people had their conference and we don't want history to read it like that. And because mostly people are kind of holistic in their view of mission. Whether you're evangelical or liberal, you've got a holistic mission. And so the Edinburgh Conference website carried all the news of the Lausanne planning and of the Tokyo And the Lausanne Conference never mentioned the Edinburgh Conference, despite Doug Birdsall trying to get that to happen. Doug Birdsall was the head of the Lausanne Conference, and he couldn't get his own board to put reference to Edinburgh 2010 on the website to show the fellowship among the people. Just the fact that I showed slides of a few BU students. Okay, Casely Esamu went to Harvard Divinity School. We got his doctorate here, worked at Park Street Church. Is he going to be forever categorized as anti-ecumenical because he went to the Lausanne meeting? You know, history has to be more complex than that. And so, for whatever reason, the Lausanne people wouldn't acknowledge the other conference. I don't know why. Doug Birdsall tried.
Final wrap-up comments either from Dr. Kaoma or Dr. Thomas.
Let me just speak on the issue of evangelization. I still think that one of the central issues in the 21st century is going to be, continue to be, what we call the theology of the religions. That is, how do we as Christians feel that God is at work among people of every culture and every religious heritage? And that involves also your attitude toward evangelization. That is one side of it. So that you can have thinking persons in India saying the only way to be an authentic Christian in India is to call yourself a Hindu Christian, because the cultural milieu in which we live and breathe is a dominant Hindu. And similarly in the predominantly Muslim world, the fact is, as Dana has mentioned, of hidden Christians who are saying, we are followers of Jesus, but we are also Muslims. So that's one of the issues. And the other is evangelization. Does that also involve dealing with the issues, the broad issues of where are Christians to be the salt of the earth in the areas of society which they're going on? That is the bringing of the change that's involved in Jesus Christ into every aspect of society. And studying the literature, and of course I've written about it extensively in my new book with a historical perspective, you will find those of every one of these traditions, the Roman Catholic, the Evangelical, the Orthodox, the Pentecostal, and Independent, all addressing those two issues. What's the relation of Christian faith to other faiths? How do we live in a society which may be dominant in another religious heritage? And how can we be the salt of the earth within our societal context? So we're all wrestling with those issues together.
I think it's also important for us as we think about mission to be sensitive to the fact that there are some issues which we are not talking about in the global south. Issues of corruption, power abuse, both in churches and in community. I think those are issues which should now come to the table. I know the fear we have is that if a Westerner wants to analyze those issues, they will be called you being imperialistic. And that's why we should now start engaging the voices from the global south themselves and force them to start talking about these issues, because they are hindering mission in so many ways.
Thank you all so much. We are delighted that this conversation has begun. The conversation continues. Park Street tonight, for those of you who can come back for that, and please feel free to stick around. Thank you again.
Yeah, and because there was a little confusion about where we met today, I'd like you to know that at 8:30 in the morning,